the awards, Academy Awards coming up on Sunday. And, you know, obviously, Film Comment is not always like a publication that is necessarily driven by, you know, usual awards coverage, but it's impossible to ignore the significance of that high a profile and platform in terms of what it says about the industry and what it does in terms of representation. I don't know if anyone wants to dive in with some thoughts on that.
I can start.
Sure.
Am I on? Okay, yeah.
So.
Yeah, this year just felt like really frustrating in the acting categories. Particularly, like so I think, like just individually, the fact that like Parasite, like the cast of Parasite gets snubbed, and this is a thing that we see sort of repeatedly with Asian actors, is that like you can have this film that's like critically lauded and does really well, and obviously like the performances are a part of that, but then like that doesn't get recognized. I mean, certainly like, you know, the other thing that was frustrating to see was basically Lupita Nyongo getting just snubbed for Us. It's like, oh, she's playing two people.
Right.
I don't know that Scarlett needed both of those both of those nominations, but yeah. Okay. You know, and then the other person I would say is Alfre Woodard in Clemency, who I think probably delivered like maybe the best performance of her career. It's not an easy film. It's not a super like feel good film. She's not necessarily like an easy character in that film, and yet she plays her so well. But I think that's exactly the sort of thing that Academy voters don't necessarily appreciate, right? Like but then I mean, who knows? Because like I think there's sort of this prevailing school of thought that they like actors who are going to suffer for their art, like visibly, and be, you know. And I think like once you start sort of projecting that especially onto like people of color, and you see Halle Berry winning for, you know, Make Me Feel Good. Like there's not a whole lot of recognition of really sort of like layered and nuanced performances, the way that there often is, I think, that we take for granted for white performers.
Yeah, I think especially with Lupita Nyong'o, who for me that is probably one of the best performances by a woman this year, and I don't put too much stock in the Oscars. I find it pointless to even get in the debates about why was this person not awarded, why was this film not awarded. I always tell people this: when you're not from the US, you'll learn to dismiss the Oscars very quickly and learn that they are a local award show, as Bong Joon-ho said in an interview.
Yeah, he had some
at the same
words.
time, when someone with such an obviously skilled performance like Lupita Nyong'o, which not only is an amazing, you know, act of performance craft, but it's also the kind of performance that you think the Academy would pay attention to. It kind of checks those boxes, the kind of very external, you know, kind of weird, you said, you know, suffering for your art. It's equivalent to like what the Joker would represent as a character, right? You like become this other person, this tortured person, and you put on makeup and a different facade, and to still get overlooked. So that actually did enrage me a little bit. And she did win an Oscar for 12 Years a Slave. So, you know, and it did make
a beautiful performance.
No, it was incredible. And it was her screen debut. Totally magnificent. But to your point, it does seem that people of color get recognized when they are depicting their own trauma on screen or their historical suffering on screen, as opposed to when they are, you know, displaying skill
Right.
You know, which
like
might
when you're
be
just interesting.
yeah, and when you're doing strange things with your body and with your emotions and with your face that people can't immediately map onto some kind of anthropological or social experience,
Exactly.
you know, or trend.
Yeah, because her movement work in Us.
I
is
mean,
like,
and the remarkable thing about that performance is it's so externalized, it's in the body so much, but it's also so internalized because
yes.
it's also about imposter syndrome. And when you see that twist at the end, it makes you rethink the whole film.
Exactly.
Because the whole film, she's actually someone else, and she's able to imbibe that duality. And it's not like, you know, at least for me, I didn't know what was coming at the end. But once that ending is revealed and you rethink the whole film, you can find clues in her performance.
Yes.
So it's so internal at the same time being so expressive in the ways that I think people know how to recognize good acting. It's obvious, and at the same time, it's extremely subtle.
And what's weird, I'm sorry, I'm going to shut up because I don't want to monopolize the whole conversation. But I just want to point this out about Lupita. And as I was looking like for historical sort of corollaries who've been sort of similarly snubbed or overlooked, she has impeccable training. And if you've ever seen her like on stage, that comes across like immediately. She did this wonderful play a few years ago. Maybe I shouldn't say it was wonderful because it was about like rape and during like the Liberian Civil War. But like having the privilege of seeing her on stage, where she's playing basically a 14-year-old girl, like I found myself just marveling at the work that she was doing, because often, you know, you see adults playing teenagers and it's just it just doesn't ring true, and there were all of these like subtleties, not necessarily even externally, but like everything from her posture, like the way that she was thinking about herself as this character, just like she made me believe she was 14. Like I, even more so after seeing her in 12 Years a Slave, like I'm like, okay, yeah, we know you're a great actor. That performance, I think, was the one where I was just like, oh, she is scary good. And you know, when I think of other actors, especially like Yale-trained actors who have been overlooked in the same way, there's like Brian Tyree Henry, who people have made the mistake of thinking that he's basically his Atlanta character, Paperboy, and then they're surprised to find out that he's not. Angela Bassett, you know, being overlooked in What's Love Got to Do with It. Yeah, even, you know, it seems like when you have the sort of formal credentials, like that training,
pedigree,
it still doesn't, it's not enough to break through necessarily.
Yeah, Lupita's snub totally like floored me, honestly. I feel so naive in retrospect for thinking that she would get in spite of, you know, the Globe snub or whatever. But, you know, piggybacking off of what you said about Alfre, you know, she has been one of my favorite actresses for a long time. And what is so frustrating to me is the fact that she disappeared from kind of the awards conversation so quickly and easily, you know, in spite of like, you can say that Neon handled Parasite's whole campaign pretty well, aside from the actors, but with Alfre, it was like kind of non-existent. And, you know, awards season is all about narratives, right? And the narrative writes itself with Alfre. You know, she's gotten one nomination for Cross Creek in like 1983 and 1984. She has so much amazing work. She was snubbed for Passion Fish in 1992. Like, she is really, really incredible. And she's been under-awarded by the Academy, you know? She's like kind of catnip for an Oscar nomination at the very least, if not a win. You know, we're seeing Renee Zellweger kind of, you know, ride I believe it was a deserved comeback narrative, you know, but like, why doesn't that kind of comeback narrative extend to a black actress, a black veteran like Alfre? It's really frustrating to see.
Yeah. I mean, especially as Soraya, you mentioned that performance is so interesting as well in Clemency, because it's, you know, it's sort of a quiet performance as well, and just also the idea of the trauma that's being expressed or portrayed in that character. It's just sort of seeps out. It's a really remarkable thing to act so internally, but also you're feeling the force even more of it. But so I guess it's because it's not as perhaps as showy as other other performances that get nominated.
I mean, sort of related to what we've been talking about is the question of authenticity that encircles people of color in all the arts fields, not just acting, but artistic output by people of color in general, I think gets sort of entrapped within standards of like authenticity. So I think in some ways realism and naturalism also get a bit redefined when it's people of color especially telling stories about their communities. And I interviewed Stephen Yun a couple years ago when he was in Burning, which we all love. Yes. And it showed at the New York Film Festival. And something he said was it was so liberating for him to play a Korean character in a Korean film set in Korea with other Korean characters so that he didn't have to be the Asian character in a film, which is what happens in Hollywood whenever he does these roles. He was in The Walking Dead. He's been in, well, Sorry to Bother You hadn't put him in a more interesting role, but often, you get singled out and you're performing your Asianness. And he said it was really liberating because he was in an Asian film, he could just be himself and he could play a cipher. His character is really a cipher. It's this completely unreadable character who is actually making use of the fact that Stephen Yeun is a Korean American, unlike the other actors who are Korean, because he's supposed to be this smooth and coolly cosmopolitan character who's sort of placeless. And you can't place where he's from, who he is. He has these kind of Western affectations. And he's making use of all of that. And he's still a cipher, which, I think in American movies that kind of cipher-esque quality, either if usually if it's an actor of color, it's either like something kind of exoticist, they become this like exotic, mysterious creature, or again, they are what they represent. They are their story. And so it was really interesting to hear him talk about that. And then with Sorry to Bother You, in which he played a union organizer, he said it was also interesting that he was in this movie that was predominantly about black workers and black labor, and that he sort of understood that his role was to sort of recede a little bit, and he understood that what his place was in the kind of dynamics of that film, but he also thought that it was significant that as an Asian person, he was cast as this everyman. Like, he was the everyman in this film full of really ridiculous, over-the-top characters, and he was kind of the straight man, the everyman. Yeah, which again is like, usually that role is a white person, and so how much he enjoyed receding a little bit and being able to still be part of this kind of cross-racial solidarity story of that particular film, but at the same time being this low-key character. So, it's fascinating to think about the ways in which also, because of a certain kind of scarcity, because you never see more than one, you never see two black characters or two Asian characters in a movie unless it's like about them, right? There's always like that one friend, one Asian friend, one black friend, that sort of thing. What kind of parameters that also creates for those actors' performances and their reception?
It was also interesting on the topic of Asian actors to see The Farewell just get completely snubbed across the board. I love that movie a lot, but I do have to say I was kind of skeptical of Awkwafina's ability to kind of crack the Best Actress list, because I think it was a very recessive performance. I thought that she was very charming and very moving. And I really, what I really did think, again, just kind of like talking about narratives and award season narratives, is that the whole like Golden Globe win, being like, oh, she is, I believe, the first Asian American winner of the Golden Globe for Best Actress for a musical comedy. I thought that would kind of like linger in Oscar voters' minds and be like, oh yeah, this would be a really important, like, symbolic, nomination, because there hasn't been an Asian actress nominated in Best Actress since 1936, which it was Merle Oberon. It's crazy, you know?
It's crazy.
And I mean, so many of the performances in The Farewell were so beautiful. I also really was holding out hope for Zhao Suzhen, who I thought was...
Nominate Nai.
Yeah, I don't know. I think like for some reason Yalitza Aparicio's like extremely well-deserved nomination last year made me very hopeful that, you know, they would recognize, you know, performances that are kind of not your typical Oscar performances, and yet that was snubbed too, you know. And
It really is cyclical. But I mean, like, I guess like this is the year of the disaffected white man. Like that is the narrative this year. So this is like, I feel like I come back to this book so much when I'm writing. It's African American Actresses, The Struggle for Visibility, 1900 to 1960 by Charlene Register, which I highly recommend. But one of the actresses that she writes about in here is Louise Bevers, who, you know, was often stuck sort of playing these like stereotypical roles in early Hollywood. And, you know, the thing that strikes me about Louise is that she'd never lived in the South. And, quote, she had to learn the Negro dialect just as one learns a foreign language. I couldn't even understand the language, but I kept studying, reading books and poems, and finally mastered the dialect to sufficiently use it in screen roles. And she'd also had limited experience as a servant. And yet, you know, yeah, we're sort of projecting this, oh, okay, well, she must be from Alabama and, you know, was cleaning white ladies' toilets and maybe got some sort of break in Hollywood, and now she's just doing that, but on screen. But no.
Right.
Right. That's actually, and we've been talking, that's great that you brought her up, Imitation of Life.
Yes.
Yeah, and because another thing I wanted to do was talk about just sort of actors that aren't talked enough about historically, and that's a great movie example for that. And Mayukh, actually, you just mentioned Merle Oberon. I wonder if you...
Yeah, so Merle Oberon, for those of you who are unfamiliar, she was born in British India in the early 1900s, and she went on to have a pretty lucrative Hollywood career, and she was Kathy in Wuthering Heights opposite Laurence Olivier in 1939, and she got one nomination in her career for The Dark Angel, which is a movie that's like kind of impossible to find unless you watch TCM and, you know, have a video recorder or whatever, but you know, I think that today it seems like critical consensus seems to say that she was a very dull actress or just not very interesting. But what is more interesting about her, which is, first of all, an assessment that I disagree with completely, but we'll get to that in a second. What is very compelling to a lot of people is her backstory. So she basically, throughout her life, she, I think, died in her 60s. She went to great pains to kind of conceal her parentage. So her father, as far as we know, is white. Her mother was mixed South Asian, a little bit Maori. But basically, Merle Oberon, she passed herself off as white throughout her whole career and very steadfastly kind of just denied any sort of South Asian parentage. There's some infamous story about her trying to pass off her mother as her maid because she was so dark-skinned and she was so ashamed of her mother being visibly South Asian. And there's another story also of her trying to basically concoct this narrative that she was actually from Tasmania and she had this whole visit planned to Tasmania and then kind of backed out of it at the last second when people asked her about her birth records. So, you know, she really just concealed her heritage. And I think that I can't help but watch her today and watch her in Wuthering Heights and all these other movies that she was in. And that kind of floods just whatever I'm seeing on the screen. You know, there's something kind of anxious and like really compelling as a result about her screen presence, you know? And I think that she is one of those actors who's probably due for a sustained critical, like a reconsideration that doesn't kind of see her acting like in, you know, as kind of like, you know, siloed from this backstory. I kind of want to see a critical reevaluation of her like that brings these two things in concert, you know? I'd love to write it, but...
We can work on that, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned her, and I was thinking earlier today about Sabu. Yes. And so one way of kind of becoming part of the industry here was to maybe for her was to like completely conceal her parentage and try to pass as white. And for Sabu, it was to just play into the stereotype, right? Just be Mowgli, be like the elephant boy, just kind of embrace the character of the South Asian person in the West. And I was actually looking up his biography today, and what I found really interesting was that he eventually became a US citizen, and then he was cast in an Indian movie, but he couldn't get a work permit to make that movie in India. And so he never made any Indian movies. He only worked for British and American directors. But you know, that is the thing. Like, you can see that even today, that being sort of the two poles that of how actors of color like either have to really embrace what's kind of expected of them, or they have to really go in the other direction. And you hear, I mean, this is actually something I'm interested in discussing, the idea of colorblind casting and acting. That's, you know, kind of talked about more and more. And it's a very difficult bind for me to think through, because on the one hand, you know, I think roles should not be defined by someone's race. I'm sure it's really exhausting. Just like as a writer, it's exhausting to be asked to constantly write about where you come from and your background. As an actor, it's probably really exhausting to constantly have to play characters who are, you know, representatives of your culture and race. At the same time, I don't think it's possible to elide your race when you're playing any character, right? Like, there's something rings false also in those films in which the film just ignores the fact that this person is a person of color in this particular setting. So the history of David Copperfield, yeah. So I saw it at TIFF. I don't think it's out yet. It's not out yet. Yeah, and it's kind of like an adaptation of the book, but with completely colorblind casting. And the lead is played by Dev Patel, and there's various other actors. And it was a really refreshing and fun way to encounter that story. At the same time, at that time in Britain, if you have Indian and Black people in that context, I think it just feels artificial not to address what it meant to be a brown or a Black person in colonial industrial Britain. So, and that's something it's kind of an impasse for me to kind of think through, like what should be expected in terms of creating inclusive roles and casting processes.
It's weird. It's weird. I mean, did anybody else see like the news about Barnes and Noble basically like issuing new editions of like classic works, but sort of retconning the covers with brown people? And
I saw that.
Yeah. But and it's like, I don't know that you quite thought this through. But I think part of the discomfort with that, and this goes to what you're saying, Devika, is that like for so long, it's been possible for white people to exist on screen without necessarily being white. Like they're just not anything. They're not raced. But when people of color are on screen, we're always raced. Like even, and to the point that like when you have something like David Copperfield, where you're like, it's sort of head scratching. But like we don't have this situation where like we have to think about the white character's whiteness in almost anything. Like that is the exception to the rule.
Yeah, no, I'm really interested to see David Copperfield. I didn't go to TIFF. I didn't see it. Because I think Dev Patel, he is an actor who has had to play a lot of these like weird subservient roles, like a Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. Like, are you kidding me? Like, this is so embarrassing,
I mean, even Slumdog Millionaire, what is so hilarious about that movie and his role, which he won so much acclaim for it, is he is a British man, playing a resident of a slum in Mumbai, and he's talking in his British accent, in English. It's all so weird and fake, and that's the, role that people just kind of showered him and the movie with acclaim. So it is like kind of satisfying to them see him play David Copperfield. I will say he was probably like, this is karma. Like, I earned this because I did that. But but sorry, I interrupted you. But he's played all these like weird, very racialized roles that I don't think were the best displays of his charm and his range.
Yeah, he was very charming. Although I will say that he wasn't nominated for Slumdog Millionaire, which is very interesting. It took a Lion for him to finally be nominated for an Oscar. But speaking of South Asian actors who were not nominated, sorry to have a second answer to your initial question. Victor Banerjee in A Passage to India by David Lean in 1984. So Victor Banerjee is kind of a veteran of Bengali cinema. He worked a lot with Satyajit Ray, and Satyajit Ray was actually the person who recommended him for this role. And I know that David Lean had a lot of trouble kind of trying to get an actual Indian actor as opposed to a British Indian actor for this role, but there's some sort of like law back then, or I don't know, some labor stuff. Anyway, he did get Victor Banerjee, and for anyone who's seen that movie, he really nails that role. I mean, it is just such a compelling mix of kind of like this fury and pride and earnestness and shame, and he navigates all of these shifts in his character so beautifully. And that year, like 1984 and 1985, like A Passage to India cleaned up like at, the Oscars, like in terms of nominations. It got like 11 nominations, Best Picture, Best Director. Judy Davis got in Best Actress kind of as a surprise, and I love her. She's wonderful in that movie. But Victor Banerjee was snubbed, and who was he snubbed for? He was snubbed for like a Sam Waterston in The Killing Fields, and I love Sam. I'm glad that he is an Academy Award nominee, but I don't think that he's spectacular in that movie. I also think it's weird that Hang S. Noor was not nominated in lead, even though I think he is the lead. But that's another conversation. And then Jeff Bridges for Starman, and that was just kind of like a left field nomination. And like Victor Banerjee, he got a bunch of Critics Awards that year. He got a BAFTA nomination. He was very much in the conversation, so his snub felt kind of like an intentional thing almost, and it just really makes no sense when you watch the movie today, to me at least.
Yeah. It's also, I think what's interesting to consider, like when we're going back to these, especially when we're looking back, is, and I wish I had done more of this, is actually kind of looking more at the gossip columns during that time. Because the thing that, I think especially with this year that you start to realize is like the cliques that exist, like you begin to see, like who's rooting for who sort of like sees who, and why. And every once in a while, you'll get someone who will, especially, this is, even though like the Hollywood Foreign Press can be like incredibly frustrating, the one thing I appreciate about the Golden Globes is that you do in vino veritas, right? Like, like there, every once in a while, a little something will come out, right? Like this year, it was basically like Renee and her like drunken Texas drawl, like dragging Hollywood for being like, for ignoring her, and then oh, you realized I exist again, right? Like, but like one of the things I was thinking about this week is how that's affected Gugu Mbatha-Raw, who like was terrific in Belle, but like most recently, like after watching the morning show in its entirety, it feels really strange that so much of the attention has been focused on Jennifer Aniston and Reese Witherspoon, and almost none of it, like at all, has gone to Gugu, who really has like the difficult work to do in that series, and who pulls it off beautifully. It's not a melodramatic performance. It's like, it's very sort of interior, and she's an incredible performer, whether you've seen her in that, or in the like superhero movie that she did with, oh God, Lorraine. Do you know who I'm thinking of? Fast Color.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. With her and Fast Color. Although also, now that I'm thinking about it, like her co-star in that is also like criminally overlooked. Like it's, again, like with object work, like what she does like with a single like cigarette draw is just beautiful. Yeah. And like there's so little appreciation for those sorts of like quiet graces
Yeah.
when they're there.
Yeah, and just talking about, that's interesting. That seems to be this kind of vicious cycle in terms of visibility and invisibility that seems to happen. So I sort of then start thinking about movies that don't even have the benefit of being in this general conversation. Even historically in any sort of awards recognition or other kind of official recognition. Soraya, when we were emailing a bit before, one actor that you mentioned was Henry G. Sanders.
Yes.
Who was in
He was in
Killer of Sheep, right?
Yeah.
So that's a movie that itself had like its period of total invisibility,
Right.
despite being just like a 20th century stone cold classic and hugely influential.
Yeah.
It's and so that's a different kind of invisibility as well.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to correct myself. I was talking about Lorraine Toussaint as Gugu's co-star in Fast Color. I just said Lorraine, and I was like, I know her last name. Because she's wonderful in so many things. Like, just almost, it feels effortless. Like, she just makes it look so easy. But yeah, when we're talking about Henry, I think he's one of those actors that doesn't really fit into sort of easy, like predetermined slots for what black men should be on screen. But also like most of his career, I think after that was like largely in television and not film. Although like I'm really happy to see him in Queen Sugar. Like he's in one of the supporting roles there. Because if there's anybody who like knows her LA Rebellion film history, it's Ava DuVernay.
Right.
And actually see him like be like used and appreciated. But like I feel like there are just so many actors who you can list where it's such a shame. Like they're clearly talented. They're clearly, capable of doing amazing things, who just don't get the chance. In fact, I think I was writing in my note, I was like, oh yeah, it's the Viola Davis quote from the Emmys, right? Like you can't win awards for roles that don't exist. And that's the story for like so many of these actors. And sometimes it's just, it really comes down to, I think, that like you have this sort of structure of like what's expected of actors of color. And then on top of that, you have sort of like the general like social strata of Hollywood that you can sort of piece together from reading like the gossip items and like who's friends with who and who's hanging out with who. And for folks who don't like fit into those kind of preordained cliques, like Bokeem Woodbine, I think is another example of that, who's just been around doing like terrific work for years and years. And who was like, he's just a gem in Queen and Slim.
Yeah.
Like he's, just like weird ass Louisiana, like kind of probably involved in some questionable stuff, and everything from like wardrobe, the voice, like all of it, like he is that weird Louisiana uncle. And like you almost never see, like you almost never see. Louisiana itself is just such a repository of weirdness. Like I love it for that. And it feels like so often like we never just sort of get past like, surface level like Bobby Boucher.
Right.
This idea of Louisiana bumpkins. And I'm like, oh, but there's so much in between, right? And like Bokeem is pulling at like so much of that.
Yeah.
But he was also like, I'm thinking of Fargo when he was like the television adaptation of Fargo. And I'm forgetting which season that it was, where he basically plays this character named Mike Milligan, who like runs around with these two like white Irish guys, and they're Mike Milligan and the Kitchen Brothers. And he's also just like amazingly terrifying in that, almost like sociopathic in the way that he's sort of like, in the way that he takes pleasure in violence. Like there's this scene, I think probably the scene that stuck with me the most is he's reciting Jabberwocky. And it's like menacing and unexpected, and you're just like, what is going on? And he pulls it off. But again, I think that year he did not win the Emmy for that, because it would have been limited series, and I'd have to go back and see who did. But I was like, oh, come on.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up another interesting topic of the various kind of tensions and conflicts in performing violence, and also in like heroes versus villains. How do you embody a hero villain? And Soraya, I was actually just reading your piece about Bad Boys for Life. Well, just the question which you raise in the article about that it's the idea of a cop as like a swaggering kind of central figure is a bit more fraught now than, say, I don't know, early 90s Michael Bay era.
So one of like the most recent essays I did was basically kind of just a long look at Will Smith in particular, and how he became like the biggest movie star in the 1990s, like the biggest movie star in the world at one point. And like when you go back and you look at his repertoire, in all of these blockbusters that he did, and he like deliberately pursued, like he's been very open about that, you realize, like there's like one after another role where he's basically playing like a cop, like he's playing some sort of authority figure, like even if it's an unexpected way, like it's not the first thing you see because he's not necessarily showing up with a badge, but in Men in Black he's playing a space fed. In Wild Wild West he's playing basically whatever the precursor to the Secret Service was. In I, Robot he's playing like a futuristic, like turns out to be a cyborg cop. And like the biggest franchise, I think, I would say the biggest franchise like in his history, right, is Bad Boys, where he's playing this like very sort of type A, womanizing, shoot first, ask questions later cop. And my question was whether this would still play as well, like in the sort of post Black Lives Matter era. Apparently it does, because like it's the like highest grossing film of the franchise, and they're making another one. So good for you, Will Smith, I guess. But I mean, beyond that, there's a history when it comes to like sort of ingratiating yourself to white audiences if you're a Black actor, and one of kind of the most effective ways of doing that is by playing a cop. And sometimes, like a lot of times, those roles take into account, like what does it mean to be a Black cop in particular, right? Like you see that with Sidney Poitier in The Heat of the Night. You see that, I think, more explicitly in this most recent version of Bad Boys, where the sort of lines between Marcus and Mike. Marcus is the guy that's played by Martin Lawrence. Thank you. Sorry, it's been a long week. But Marcus sort of, they kind of draw out not only like Marcus's just exasperation with violence, but also, there's a scene where he's literally like praying in a church, and he's like, I swear, like all the guys that we killed, they were bad guys, I promise. Like, it wasn't an unarmed Black kid. Like he doesn't say that explicitly, but that's that's sort of the implication in that scene. Interesting. But whether you have like Eddie Murphy or Danny Glover, like over and over, like this is, Alyssa Rosenberg calls it the citizenship machine. And so it's a way to kind of like put yourself in a role that is like traditionally respected and praised in American society, particularly like when you look at the history of the film industry and how much anxiety there is over like Black men's sexuality, or not just Black men, but like Black sexuality on screen, period, to the point that like studios were basically censoring themselves because if you had too much or any Black romance on screen, like those movies just wouldn't play in the South. Like the exhibitors just wouldn't run the movies.
And the ratings board also is pretty
Exactly.
skewed in terms of how it rates.
Yeah, and so like later on, one of the like when you have sort of these hurdles, like this going through the citizenship machine of playing a police officer, and to some, to a certain extent, also playing an American soldier, is a way to basically, I don't want to say get around that, but it's I'm the friendly Black man, right? I'm the safe Black man. Like you can trust me. And even like it's funny because I'm like Bad Boys is a very sort of like typical like bang bang bang, lots of explosions franchise, but there's all these weird little undercurrents in it, particularly like with the first one, where you have Marcus and Mike like basically impersonating each other through most of the movie, and there is this like very obvious sexual tension with Téa Leone's character that never sort of actually gets like truly consummated. It's suggested, but it's not like, okay, he's cool enough that like this white girl would be into him, but we're not actually going to show you. Sorry, that was a tangent.
It's a valuable one, I think.
Your discussion of the Black cop character as this neutralizing role that many actors were playing, it's making me think of Watchmen, which I know you love. I haven't watched as much of it, but it did strike me as very interesting in that it was kind of reconfiguring some of those tropes and what it could mean to play that character. And Regina King obviously plays a cop, a vigilante cop. But it's also, I mean, more largely, I feel like television has been way more complex in the roles that actors of color have been playing. Like one TV show, it's kind of my comfort TV show, is This Is Us. Yeah. And I just love Sterling K. Brown, who was also in Black Panther, who's also been in movies and is now in Marvelous Mrs. Maisel as well. Him and his whole family and that arc is, I mean, they're able to explore so many intricate themes about race that I don't see in movies. And I think that somehow it's the breadth of the TV show, breadth of a show, and also what TV has been open to these days in terms of narratives, and that you really get to grow with these characters and they endear themselves to you, and you see them as people because you kind of see them in all their complexity. And I'm not sure how the statistics compare, but I wonder if actors of color have been doing better in television recognitions and awards than in movies, at least on a more in the field of just like media coverage and sort of cultural importance. It feels like people pay more attention, and there have been more interesting roles on television than on film.
Although certainly, like, yes, and I think I wouldn't say single-handedly attribute that to Shonda Rhimes, but certainly she is deserving of like a huge bulk of the credit for that. I mean, before Kerry Washington was nominated for Scandal, like it had been like 40 some odd years that a Black woman had been nominated for like actress in a leading role in a drama for an Emmy. It was, oh God, she played like Julia. Why can't I remember any?
Diane Carroll?
Diane Carroll. Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Like it was Diane Carroll and then nobody and then Kerry Washington. But you see it like Regina gets Emmy's love and respect. And actually I will hit on Watchmen for like to make a brief point. And again, I'm going to come back to something that Alyssa Rosenberg told me. She's a culture critic at the Washington Post who did this like massive multi-part series on policing and pop culture. And she basically, the way she, when we were talking about Watchmen, she was like, it's both revolutionary and reactionary. Because she's saying, you know, one of the sort of easy ways to communicate that, like, you trust them, like, I don't know that, I think basically what she said, she was like, I don't know that there's anything more American than saying, like, we trust you to be violent with criminals. But, like, even within that, like, the show and what's happening to Regina is also arguing that, like, there's still no escaping sort of, like, systemic racism, to the point that it has poisoned the entire Tulsa Police Department. Or most of it. And so, yeah, like, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion about that. I think because it's not an easy thing to discuss. And because, like, it's very sort of singular in what it's doing there. There's a lot of nuance there that's really interesting in terms of what they're doing.
I'm just going to jump in here because I want to make sure the audience has a chance. If you have any questions you want to pose to our panel. Anyone? Yes, second from the back there. If you could just wait for a second while we bring the mic to you.
Thank you very much. One thing you mentioned was authenticity and about the opportunities for roles. And what I thought of was some of these movies in the past, like Jennifer Jones playing Love is a Many Splendor Thing, or Louise Rayner playing The Good Earth, about these they're playing these characters that are not even the race. And someone told me at a party, I'm not sure if this is true, they want Julia Roberts to play Harriet Tubman. This is someone swore to that I couldn't believe it, but that's what someone told me at a party last year.
Back in the 90s, like, there was a film executive, I think, like, there was, like, this was in the trades, like, it was, seriously, like, there was a story about it, because I think
it's like it is true.
Yeah, one of the writers of Harriet, because that film had been in development for, like, forever, and in the 90s, they were like, oh, we can get Julia Roberts to do it, like, nobody, and it's like, and they're like, oh, it'll be fine. Everybody loves her. You know, who cares?
Yeah, I feel like there's a kind of uninterrogated history there. It needs a little more unpacking because, like Anna May Wong, for example, she really wanted Louise Rayner's role in The Good Earth, and yet she, for some totally racist reason, did not get it. Another performance that comes to mind is Linda Hunt in The Year of Living Dangerously. I think that is like one of the best performances to ever win an Oscar. But she's not Asian, you know, and nor is she. I believe that character's a man, Billy Kwan. So it's just like, you know, if I don't think that role would fly today, you know, or her playing that role specifically.
Oh no.
Actually, yeah, I'm being. What
You're
am I talking
forgetting
about?
Tilda Swinton.
Yeah, that's true. They'd probably give her an Oscar today too. Let's be honest.
Another question here in the middle. Yeah.
Just a very open question. Any opinions about Hispanic actors of color? I can get into so much, but let's just throw that out there.
You mean like distinctions between, like, Black Latinos and...
Like I said, there's a lot I could get into.
Okay, or
so I just want to throw it out there and see where you guys run with it.
Or
'Cause
like,
if not, I'll be here forever.
You know, like a Colombian playing like a Mexican
There's a lot.
person,
I mean, there's what the first thing you said. There's white passing Hispanic actors of color. There's, you know, the gender sort of conformities and how, you know, women have to kind of sexy it up. There's so many things I can go into, but
that's a whole other. I mean, okay, so I feel like the most high profile example of this is probably when J-Lo played Selena, right? Like there was like a big sort of like intra Latinx conversation about the fact that this Puerto Rican woman was playing a Mexican or Mexican American woman. Although, like, she did it so well that you know, I think she was kind of forgiven for it. I think what's more irritating is, like, a few years ago, maybe this was like 2014, 2015-ish, like there was an announcement in the trades that Catherine Zeta-Jones was going to be playing Griselda Blanco, which drove me insane. Because Catherine Zeta-Jones is despite the fact, despite what you may think, because of Legend of Zorro, is not Latina in any way. But I think also, like, Jennifer Lopez might have signed up to also play her.
Yeah. I think that she wants to direct a Griselda biopic. Ooh. So I did want to talk actually briefly about Jennifer Lopez. I'm please, sorry. Yeah. I just I'm not a huge fan of her singing, but as an actress, I've always had a lot of affection for her. And I think that it's so easy for people to forget that before On the Six came out in 1999, she was an actress, and she wasn't just some actress. She was working with Oliver Stone, Coppola, Steven Soderbergh, Bob Rafelson, and Gregory Nava twice, before she started her singing career. And I was really, it just kind of circled back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this conversation. I was totally shocked that she did not get a nomination, but that seemed like such a gatekeeping gesture to me, this kind of you can't sit with us, you're not one of us, and I don't know what
That's exactly what that was. Yeah. And I think that goes back a long ways. Again, if you want to look at sort of the intersection of gossip and how that influences
I think I know what you're going to say.
Perceptions of performances. Okay, so for one, I think her character and her performance in Hustlers is really interesting and just underappreciated by the Academy. And I think there was the anonymous comment that ended up on page 6 or in the New York Post. Well, that's not an Oscar movie. That's not an Oscar role. Whatever. I'd like to see you hoist yourself up a pole. That shit's hard.
But that's also related to actors of color having to play respectability roles or sympathy roles, and they're just. I'm not the biggest fan of the movie, but I do think it's it's a really it's fascinating roles, and it's a great showcase of their skills.
Exactly.
And they are women of color who are morally very murky in the film.
Exactly.
And,
yes.
Playing a profession that people already kind of denigrate and doing it with a lot of pizzazz and with a lot of confidence.
In a way that we're totally fine with if it's The Big Short. If it's a bunch of white guys.
Yeah, or even Ocean's 11, or, it's a very classic kind of heist film. Yeah. And I do think that there's a hint of that in the way that it's been dismissed.
Yeah, I think the other thing, the thing that I would go back to, because I don't think this was ever really explored, but if you go back and you look at the way, if you look at sort of the public conversation about her relationship with Ben Affleck, it is, I think, laced with this anxiety about her brownness. No one will come out and say it, remember, but this was the era when everyone was oh my God, J-Lo got an ass. And she was dating this man who was, right, he's tall, he's won an Oscar for Good Will Hunting. He was, he is a primo, A-list white man Hollywood catch. And he is dating Jennifer Lopez.
I like that your two things where he is tall and won an Oscar.
But, when you look at the ways that someone Ben Affleck or this season, Brad Pitt, have really sort of been welcomed and celebrated, and they're just yes, you got rid of this annoying woman that we didn't whether it's Jennifer Lopez or in Brad's case, Angelina Jolie. There is this idea of women in Hollywood where who you were dating and how, or married to, and how that is received also ends up playing into your, weirdly playing into your awards chances. And it's definitely different for men because Eddie Redmayne, like had the opposite effect, right? When he like very quickly got married and like had a kid, and that was like that was a great thing for him. But if you are a woman and you are perceived as like taking, you know, this man off the market that people think you don't actually deserve, like you are vilified.
Yeah, and one last point about gossip, I know we want to get to other questions, is that there's also this 1998 Movie Line interview with Jennifer Lopez that is kind of infamous now, but basically in it, you know, she regarded herself as a serious actress because she very much was a serious actress, but in that interview, she kind of just trashed a lot of her contemporaries, Gwyneth Paltrow, Madonna, Winona Ryder, etc. And I think a lot of these assessments were like, you know, not totally unfair, you know, Team J-Lo. But, you know, I do think that I have to wonder how much kind of like lingering resentment over the bridges that she burned because of that kind of interview, you know, led to a snub, you know, like 20 years later, you know?
Yeah.
Well, you know, that also makes
Gwyneth
me...
is telling people to put like crazy shit in their vaginas, and that's fine.
You know, that also makes me think of like actors who are allowed to behave badly, and that's viewed as cute and zany, and oh, it's just a renegade. Like, one of my favorite actors right now is Lakeith Stanfield. And I don't think there's like any backlash against him, but I also feel so protective because he is so individualistic. Even his roles, I mean, he's just a chameleon, and he is able to play super distinctive characters in every film. I mean, most recently in Uncut Gems, where he was like one of the lower key characters in that film, but he's also like so mysterious and weirdly aggressive and so funny. And he was in Sorry to Bother You and in Atlanta. But he's also... I've seen. I mean, he could have done more in Knives Out, but it is evidence of his range,
right?
But you know, I feel like I've seen him be like super funny and also very outspoken and like very open to making fun of people in the industry, not in any offensive way, at least like so far. But you know, even when I see his social media interactions, and I'm always scared, like, you know, that. That's gonna like tick off those in power or something, because we know that you know, actors of color are generally not allowed to be those kinds of outsider figures.
Yeah, that was actually like, I think one of the things that got sort of that was left out of the story, and I tweeted about this a little bit about the cop essay, was like basically what we were coming back to is like, who is allowed to be weird. And who, you know, and particularly when it comes to like actors of color, can there be like more than one weird one at a time, right? Like if Lakeith is sort of in that role right now, does that mean that like that's it, and like nobody else can be the weird black guy except for him, which is like just a shame. But I'm speaking of his range, I'm very curious. I haven't seen the photograph yet.
Oh yeah.
I think the one thing that the hump that he might have to overcome is whether we can see him as a romantic lead. Like if that's a comfortable fit for him, I don't know.
I can see him
as
romantic.
I like, cause did you see Jessica James?
I did.
Did you like him in that?
I don't remember him in that.
Well, there
That's
you go.
crazy. Yeah, now that I actually kind of forgot about that movie, but he was in that, and he was a romantic lead. Huh.
I don't know. I'm curious.
Well, to be continued. So we're sort of running at the end of our time, but I want to get in a couple more questions. I think you had yeah.
Well, I was going to ask what would have to change to remedy this, because it seems as if there's Hollywood, the system has a short-term memory. And when you have outspoken comments, as much as we have our POTUS saying extreme things, we also have people in the industry saying extreme things, people that are respected. So like the case of the Exodus film, Ridley Scott blatantly said, oh, well, and he used some like obvious name like Mustafa something. Are we gonna have Mustafa so-and-so play these characters? And yet I thought, you know, the system says that if someone's a box office success, that sort of puts aside that, and we can put anyone in a role, you know, and or if you have a successful producing, directing team, they also can knock things out. So in other words, from almost 50 years in the business, Ridley Scott could pick anyone he wants to play roles that we know are from history, not white European characters, and they would become those characters. So what would have to change to make things, or given the fact that I think Tilda Swinton, as wonderful as I love she is, I think Michelle Yeoh could have very well been in Doctor Strange and have been equally successful because it's a superhero movie and it's a franchise. So what would have to change to remedy these things, or will it be another case that next year they'll forget everything again?
I think the optimistic answer to this, and I think it's naively optimistic, is that and what people love to say is, oh, the only color that matters in Hollywood is green, and that is not true. I think I would say you can see that this year with Us, which was one of the few original screenplay, it was the highest grossing original screenplay,
top 10, the only one
film
maybe
of this year, and yet, that's, we just don't talk, Jordan Peele is not talked about in those terms. I for a while, once the Academy in particular was really loud about sort of stepping up their diversity efforts, and they were inviting all of these new people into the Academy, and they kept doing that. On the one hand, you want to be optimistic about that. On the other hand, even when they invite several hundred people, in an Academy class, that has racial and gender parity, because the Academy is so incredibly white and male, the percentage difference is maybe 1% a year, 2% a year, that they're growing toward parity. It will take decades at the rate that they're going, unless, okay, so some old folks will die every year, but sorry, but still, at the rate that they are going, it's still, and this is them doing a good job and being proactive about it. It's still glacial. But I think, it's just like anything else where you have these sort of deeply ingrained attitudes. If you looked at the Hollywood Reporter cover that had a photograph of the 6 studio heads, they're all white, I think. Maybe there's one black person. The major studio heads. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's, you really sort of have to have a massive revolution that takes place from the very top all the way to the bottom, right? We spend a lot of time talking about the most visible people. We're talking about actors and to a certain point directors. Below the line is terrible, to the point that you have, there are actors now who basically have enough pull that if Denzel Washington is working on a film, the crew is actually going to be reflective of America, because that's one of the things that he stipulates. But if you leave this up to just individuals, nothing actually changes. Right? I think certainly the guilds could do more, in terms of the sort of stipulations and guidelines that they issue, for projects that their members are working on. But it has to come both from the top down and the bottom up. It has to be holistic.
Mayukh, did you want to jump into something?
Oh, yeah. Just in terms of awards bodies, one thing is I do think sustained public pressure for these, institutions that are kind of arthritic at this point, like to do better. Like I want the Academy to feel kind of embarrassed in the same way that the BAFTAs, like I hope they were embarrassed too for only nominating, white actors this year. I don't believe there's a single actor of color nominated this year. That's one thing, but parallel to that, I also want to kind of, it's going to sound very like anarchist of me, but like just like imagine like a system where like awards, or at least this like the Oscars, do not matter so much culturally and do not determine who gets capital and who gets access, and who gets the opportunities. I really want to imagine that kind of world, in which we don't put that much stock in these awards that were never like the barometer of quality to begin with. We just need to acknowledge that truth and just like create our own futures in some way. That sounds totally idealistic, but it's something to work towards.
Yeah, and create alternative circles and supporting local like repertory theaters and sort of non-corporate means of accessing and making and seeing movies. It probably maybe is like feels like a drop in the bucket, but I just, like I said at the beginning of this, I just can't put stock in the Oscars, I mean, they just feel so meaningless to me, which I know is not entirely correct. They do have such a big impact on who gets to make movies, who gets roles, but it's just like a really honestly cynical and kind of depressing to keep like hoping for them to change, and
they don't have credibility.
No, and as you said, the pace is so glacial, and at the end of the day, it's a mass voting block of all the powerful people in Hollywood, so for me, it's like find other ways, read independent criticism, watch things at your local film society. This is not an advertisement.
I mean, they just
look, very nicely done,
they clearly, like, they don't appreciate Claire Denis. They don't appreciate Terrence Malick. They don't appreciate Anya Zapata either.
Yeah.
So,
we probably should finish now, but since we started a little late, I want to make sure we got one more question. I think there was a question in the back. Yeah. We're going to record.
So a couple of days ago in, I think, Hollywood Reporter, they had an anonymous Oscar voter that chimed in and said that
the infamous
chimed in and said that Parasite should not have been nominated for Best Picture because it has the best foreign. It's nominated on the foreign language feature, which is, I want to get your thoughts individually on it. I guess we'll start with his, because he's obviously more shook up than anything else. And you're the most optimistic one out of the group. So, yeah, so far, I mean, you're the one who said, hey, maybe.
Oh, that's interesting. Yikes. I was not aware that I was coming across that way.
Question that you brought up, and when you were answering him, you had the optimism. Everybody's
You're
like,
the
nah.
Pollyanna here.
You brought that.
Okay, well, that runs counter to my public persona. I think that obviously that whole opinion is like total bullshit, and it just kind of reinforces Bong Joon-ho's assertion that the Oscars are fundamentally local, But at the same time, I will say that I have had trouble with the ways in which the Oscars, like at least when it comes to performances, like which foreign films, foreign performances it kind of picks as kind of career tributes. It's weird, right? Like Catherine Deneuve gets like, and she's obviously a white actress, but like she gets nominated for like Indochine, which is like, who's gonna remember that when they write her obituary? It's not one of her best performances. Why is it that certain like it just feels kind of weird and almost tokenistic sometimes to see which performances from foreign actors kind of get picked to like join the club, or like oh, this is your year, oh, Isabelle Huppert, you can have this if you want, like I don't really like that. I don't know what the solution is. That said, I think that like Parasite even being nominated for Best Picture is like the closest since probably Moonlight, honestly, where like a Best Picture nominee and hopefully eventually winner has reflected actual quality, and so
as a Best Picture, yeah.
I have complicated feelings about Roma. Not a huge fan. Love Yalitza. I think she was the best part of it. That's another conversation. But yes, best since Moonlight, in my opinion.
I mean, I honestly think the Oscars should just like set really strict and narrow parameters for what they are. And they should just be like, movies made in America or something, because I almost think that's better than them trying to be more international, because then every gesture of internationalism is so paternalistic. Yes. and cherry picks certain kinds of narratives, you cannot decide the best movies made in the world. That is an impossible task. What you can do, best movies made this year in the United States of America. And then we'll all be like, these are the American awards, and these were the awards that the people in America who work in Hollywood thought were the best movies. And then we'd all be happy. No, Parasite does not need an Oscar to be a good movie. Parasite is a great movie.
Oh, right. That's interesting.
I'm talking in like big blanket terms. I understand that.
I like what you're saying. Yeah. Rename it, but then that British issue.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That it doesn't have to be about language. Just say it's movies made in the U.S. The Brits have the BAFTAs. Everyone has their own awards.
Or just to understand that the Oscars are fundamentally American in the same way that this is sort of just. We have this kind of like awards imperialism, like as Americans, generally, right? Because so the Chiefs win the Super Bowl, and all of a sudden they are the world champions, right?
There's always these. There's always these articles that come out during the Oscar season, and it's like, and these many Indian movies have never, or only these many have been shortlisted. These many have never won. And to me, it's like, Indian movies don't need the Oscars. Indian movies are doing fine. They don't need the Oscars. They don't need America's approval. At the same time, there is the reason to be like resentful because American movies dominate in all countries and all markets. And that's the way the world economy and the film industry, global film industry works. So there is a sense of, well, we all grew up watching your movies and your movies come to all our multiplexes and you don't know anything about, hardly pay attention to movies that are made in these other parts of the world. But I do think that the only way to kind of, really even consume the Oscars is to be like deeply, deeply cynical about them and to treat them as trivial. Trivial and local. That's the only way to like.
It's a very nice American award.
Well, this is where I'll segue into a plug for Film Comment, which embraces movies from all around the world and does not have awards. Although we do have a poll, but anyway. But thank you to our wonderful panelists and a wonderful audience for a terrific talk.